So good morning, everyone. It is 10:30 exactly on Sunday, the fifth Sunday of Lent, Sunday, March 29th. I thought I was going to be a little bit late uh, in joining you because just about 2 minutes ago, a one of the nurses here knocked on my door. They are now taking everybody's temperature. And I think that's a good thing to do. So he took my temperature with one of those little gadgets that scans your forehead. And then when it beeped, he said, "Oh, fine." And I said, "What is it?" And he said, 93. And I said, "Those things read a little bit low, don't they?" And he smiled and he said, "I take the fifth." So he's not committing himself, but it's kind of obvious that I would suspect if I read 98.6 as is normal, I wonder if they would say that, well, okay, he's normal, when probably if I know that I'm not down to 93, for God's sake. If I were, I doubt that I would be talking to you right now. So anyway, I don't know exactly what the normal range of temperature is, but I think everybody is reading kind of low. And if we were at 98.6, we might really have we might really be at 102 or 103. Anyway, who knows? They'll get it straightened out. I do think they're basically doing the right thing here at Nazareth House as far as the trying to encourage and sort of semi-enforce the pretty well enforce, actually. Getting a lot of good cooperation. The 10-foot distance and the no groups. The cost of that, of course, is that the chapel is closed. We cannot gather for Mass. We are not even at this point allowed to bring Holy Communion. That's to the people, except in case of dying. That's the regulations of the Archdiocese. I think that may be a little bit excessive, but then again, this whole thing is so new that it's maybe we should be a little bit excessive, and it may we may be grateful that it's a little bit excessive down the line. I don't know. Certainly, I think with the news that we heard yesterday or the day before that by the end of the week there may be a test that is simple, takes only 15 minutes, may be available on an ever-widening scale. If it's something that can be done and on location or on demand at a relatively low cost, that will probably go a long ways to just figuring out where we need to be really careful and where we don't have to be quite so careful. It will certainly enable us, meaning our society, our medical profession, our governmental people and all of that, to better determine how to manage the quarantines and the isolations, because with a test you can find out if a person is a carrier before there are any symptoms. And I think if we could get a handle on who might be carrying it and who might not earlier than just the appearance of symptoms with a thermometer in your forehead that doesn't seem to be reading accurately, I don't know. If the more knowledge that we can get, I think the better off we're going to be, even maybe in the short run. By short run, I'm sorry, I'm thinking 2, 3, 4 weeks, but definitely in the long run as to how a pandemic like this can play itself out and what are the dangers of it recurring periodically or seasonally. So we shall see. Today is the fifth Sunday of Lent, and I promise to make this a little bit of an examination of the Word. I hesitate to say liturgy of the Word, but certainly let's look at the Word. I just listened to, watched the Mass that was broadcast on EWTN. Somebody asked me what I thought of the homily, or whether I understood the homily or not, and I kind of said, yeah, I understood it. Unfortunately, I thought he gave about 3 or 4 homilies plastered together without much of a transition. I'm not really sure that I was able to take from it a unified message, other than, Jesus is our Savior. We need to trust in Him, and He will give us He brings us the salvation of God. Of course, that's a message that is for all times. But what I'm planning to do here today will be to begin with the collect prayer, the opening prayer of the Mass, to pray that as our opening prayer, and then go right into the Gospel. And I'm going to read the Gospel through, and then I'm going to walk us, really, through that Gospel at the same time. So let's begin in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. And as we are proceeding, may the Lord be with you, may the Lord be with all of us, and guide our spirits as we probe and penetrate His holy word. Let us pray. By your help, we beseech you, O Lord our God, may we walk eagerly in that same charity with which, out of love for the world, your Son handed him over to death. So we ask for the same kind of love that with which Jesus loved us and handed himself over to death. One of the things that we're going to discover in reading this gospel is this was the point. The raising of Lazarus was the point where Jesus himself signed and sealed his own death warrant. They were seeking to kill him before that. He had to run away from them out to Bethany beyond the Jordan. That's where John the Baptist was baptizing. He ran away from Jerusalem because they tried to stone him. Went out there with his disciples, and stayed there for a time. He was sort of in hiding, getting away from the particular faction of the Jewish leaders, who are the ones called the Jews in John's Gospel. When John speaks of the Jews, he means the leaders who were Judahites, who were Judeans, who were living in Jerusalem and who were kind of in charge. They were in charge of the religious and spiritual life of the people. They were in charge of the temple. They were the priests, the Sadducees, the folks who were the Jewish leaders. That was not the common people. That was not even the majority of the Pharisees. Jesus himself had a great sympathy to the Pharisees, which may be why he fought them so fiercely when they replaced the secondary or rather replaced the primary with the secondary, which, let's face it, is something that we all tend to do. At any rate, Jesus went off to Bethany beyond the Jordan, which is the place of the baptism, and was there when he gets the message from the other Bethany, which is near Jerusalem, where Lazarus and his sisters, Martha and Mary, were living. And it's evident that Jesus had a close relationship with that family. One last word before I begin reading the gospel. And that is the name Bethany, which is, it's interesting. Jesus is going from one Bethany to another. But the name Bethany means house of the poor and afflicted. I can't pronounce it actually in Hebrew. I didn't pay that close attention. But it means the house of the poor, house of the afflicted. Very possibly it was a place where there were a lot of poor and sick people living, as well as some people who may have been somewhat well-to-do, as it seems Lazarus and Mary and Martha were fairly well-to-do. And it was about 2 miles, that Bethany, near Jerusalem, was about 2 miles from Jerusalem itself. So it was an easy half-hour, 40-minute walk from Jerusalem, which is why we'll see there were a lot of Jews, a lot of Jewish people of influence who were friends of Martha and Mary, who were out there mourning Lazarus, the death of Lazarus. So let me get into the reading now. This is, as we know, a reading from the Holy Gospel according to John. And I'm going to just say a few words, or I'm going to read a couple of verses before our liturgical reading begins. And I'm going to put my glasses on. After the Jewish leaders picked up rocks to stone him, and after they tried to arrest him again, he escaped from them. He went back across the Jordan to the place where John first baptized, and there he remained. Many came to him and said, "John performed no sign," but everything John said about this man was true. Now, a man was ill, Lazarus from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. Mary was the one who had anointed the Lord with perfumed oil and dried his feet with her hair, and it was her brother Lazarus who was ill. So the sisters sent word to him, saying, "Master, the one you love is ill." When Jesus heard this, he said, "This illness is not to end in death, but it is for the glory of God, that the Son of God may be glorified through it." Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that he was ill, he remained for 2 days in the place where he was. Then, after this, he said to his disciples, "Let us go back to Judea." The disciples said to him, "Rabbi, the Jews were just trying to stone you, and you want to go back there?" And Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours in a day? If one walks during the day, he does not stumble, because he sees the light of this world. But if one walks at night, he stumbles, because the light is not in him." He said this, and then he told them, "Our friend Lazarus is asleep, but I am going to awaken him." So the disciples said to him, "Master, if he is asleep, he will be saved." But Jesus was talking about his death, while they thought that he meant ordinary sleep. So then Jesus said to them clearly, Lazarus has died. And I am glad for you that I was not there, that you may believe. Let us go to him. So Thomas, called Didymus, said to his fellow disciples, Let us also go to die with him. When Jesus arrived, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, only about 2 miles away, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them about their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went to meet him, but Mary sat at home. Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you. And Jesus said to her, Your brother will rise. Martha said to him, I know he will rise in the resurrection on the last day. Jesus told her, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, even if he dies, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? She said to him, Yes, Lord. I have come to believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one who is coming into the world. When she had said this, she went and called her sister Mary secretly, saying, The teacher is here and is asking for you. As soon as she heard this, she rose quickly and went to him. For Jesus had not yet come into the village, but was still where Martha had met him. So when the Jews who were with her in the house, comforting her, saw Mary get up quickly and go out, they followed her, presuming that she was going to the tomb to weep there. When Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her weeping, he became perturbed and deeply troubled, and said, Where have you laid him? They said to him, Sir, come and see. And Jesus wept. So the Jews said, See how he loved him. But some of them said, Could not the one who opened the eyes of the blind man have done something so that this man would not have died? So Jesus, perturbed again, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone lay across it. Jesus said, Take away the stone. Martha, the dead man's sister, said to him, Lord, by now there will be a stench. He has been dead for 4 days. And Jesus said to her, Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God? So they took away the stone. And Jesus raised his eyes and said, Father, I thank you for hearing me. I know that you always hear me, but because of the crowd here I have said this, that they may believe that you sent me. And when he had said this, he cried out in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. And the dead man came out, tied hand and foot with burial bands, and his face was wrapped in a cloth. So Jesus said to them, Untie him and let him go. Now, many of the Jews who had come to Mary and seen what he had done, began to believe in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. So the chief priests and the Pharisees convened the Sanhedrin and said, What are we going to do? This man is performing many signs. If we leave him alone, all will believe in him. And the Romans will come and take away both our land and our nation. But one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said to them, You know nothing, nor do you consider that it is better for you that one man should die instead of the people, so that the whole nation may not perish? He said this. He did not say this on his own, but since he was high priest for that year, he prophesied that Jesus was going to die for the nation. And not only for the nation, but also to gather into one the dispersed children of God. So from that day on, they planned to kill him. Jesus no longer walked about in public among the Jews, but left for the region near the desert to a town called Ephraim, and there he remained with his disciples. The Gospel of the Lord. I went on a little bit beyond what the liturgical reading is because I think it's really important the way that this narration of the raising of Lazarus is, as I mentioned earlier, the thing that signs and seals his death warrant. In a sense, Jesus himself gave to the Jewish leaders, the Pharisees and the chief priests in the Sanhedrin, gave them the cause for not just having some kind of an uprising that might arrest Jesus and or a mob that might stone him or try to put him to death, but gave them the opportunity to systematically join together to do away with Jesus. And that had to involve planning systematically, again, to hand him over to the Romans, so that the Romans would actually be the ones to do the deed, so that, in a sense, both the Jewish people, the Jewish leaders, their own, Jesus' own, whom he came for, and the dominant power of the rest of the world would together do away with the presence of the Son of God in their midst, with the fullness of God's presence in his love in their midst. So it's very interesting how this raising of Lazarus came together to bring about the details of the death of Jesus that in a very real way implicated all of us in his death. We cannot blame one group or another. It is all of us who, given our natural tendencies, our natural sinful tendencies that conspire, notice I put present tense there, conspire to do away with him because he challenges. He challenges our ways of looking at things because we know God's ways are not our ways. So who has to yield? We do. But we try to get God to yield. We try to get God to do things our way, even if he so very clearly gives us the sign that he loves us so much he is pouring himself out. He's emptying himself in love for us. A couple of details I'd like to point out as we are coming to this point. I mentioned the two Bethanies. And it was the Bethany across the Jordan where Jesus was coming from was about a day's journey from Jerusalem. So the point here is kind of interesting, and it's very significant to understand the significance of Lazarus' death and Jesus raising him from the dead, because the messenger carrying the message from Mary and Martha about Lazarus being sick would have taken a day to get to Bethany. What that means is it is very likely that Lazarus was so sick that while this messenger was on the way, Lazarus died. So that's the first day of Lazarus' death. Because Jesus waits another 2 days before he leaves. That means 3 days passed since Lazarus died. And then he says, let's go to Jerusalem. So on that 4th day, they are traveling to Jerusalem. Now, the burial custom was bury a dead body, a dead person's body, as soon as possible after death, because decomposition starts in right away. And so the Jewish burial custom was, as soon as possible after death, wrap the body in spices, which only worked to control the odors, for a day or so, wrap the body in spices, and then put it in a tomb. Now, tombs like that cave, and like the tomb Jesus was buried in, were temporary things. They were not the permanent resting place. They were places that they would lay out the body, allow it to decompose fully until there was nothing left except bones, which might take, upwards of a year or so, and then gather the bones together and put them into a relatively small box called an ossuary. And then that would be the permanent resting place for the body, or then the bones of the person. So this tomb was a cave that would have been widely used probably for this purpose of keeping a body for about a year until it completely decomposed, and then putting the bones in an ossuary. So by 4 days, that 4 days is a very significant thing, because it's only on the 3rd day that decomposition becomes really obvious and really repugnant. What that meant was there was always a hope for about 2 or 3 days after a person apparently died, that maybe the spirit had not yet completely left his body or her body, that maybe they could be revived, maybe they could be resuscitated, maybe they could be brought to life. You remember the incident of the widow of Naim, or the synagogue official's daughter, both of whom had just died when Jesus encountered them. The widow of Nain, the body was being brought out to its burial place on its stretcher, on its bier. So he would have just died. They were bringing him out to put him in the tomb. And at that point, maybe only a few hours after death, Jesus raised him back from the dead. Same thing with that daughter of the synagogue official. But there was always the hope that maybe just in a coma, maybe in a deep sleep, unresponsive, maybe the signs of life are gone, but the person is still alive, alive enough to come back. But after the 3rd day, by the 4th day, no hope. So actually, even the expectation that Jesus might have given rise to among the people, that son of the widow of Naim, or the son of, or the daughter of that synagogue official in Capernaum, they would have said, well, Jesus raised them from the dead. if he had gotten here early, maybe he could have done something for Lazarus. But now he is totally beyond hope. He is decomposing. He is no longer recognizable as Lazarus, the brother that we had. And they say that after 4 days of decomposition, they didn't have all the cosmetologists and among the morticians to pump formaldehyde in their brain, in their bloodstream, and all that kind of stuff. The person would be not recognizable any longer after 4 days. So it's very significant that Jesus is not just fulfilling something that had been done before. He is doing something completely new. He is bringing Lazarus forth at the point where it was impossible to be raised from the dead. And that was something new. That could only be done by the power of God. That could only be done by one who is invoking the power of God, who is in God's favor. Which makes, of course, the reaction, the response of the Jewish leaders who gathered together after that to essentially condemn Jesus to death and to look for the opportunity to arrest him and hand him over to the Romans. That makes them doubly conscious of their own sinfulness, because as religious people, they could not have been ignorant of the fact that Jesus was giving the ultimate sign that he had to be from God. It was unmistakable. It could not be denied. So they knew that. They were aware of that. But what was more important to them? I'm going to use a little bit of a loaded word here. And I'm not going to pursue it any further. But what was more important to them than being at the rights with God was what we would probably call patriotism. Jewish nationalistic identity. They knew that if this Messiah were to continue doing what he was doing, they feared that the Romans would come and destroy their people. So they did have to balance, they did have to weigh one value against another. The value of of being on the right side with God, which was obvious that Jesus was, the value of that, but on the other hand, the value of, we want to keep our people safe. We want to keep the Romans quiet and not to invade and destroy our people. We want to appease the Romans. Okay. Unfortunately, that happened about 40 years later, when a revolt got to the point where the Roman armies did invade Jerusalem and did destroy Jerusalem, destroyed the temple. 40 years later, up to the point of the last holdouts, 70 A.D., up on Masada, who committed suicide rather than yield to the Romans. So, what those Jewish leaders were afraid of happened. We, as the Christian interpretation of that, following that, tended to be, well, that did happen because of what you did. You abandoned God, in a sense, in order to try to appease the Romans. Of course, there's a lot of nuances to that history. I'm not going to go into any further discussion about that. But I do think the key here is that the Jewish leaders, the people had to trust for their religious leadership and to keep them safe, were presented with a very clear choice here. Jesus had the credentials, but we were fearing the Romans. And we know how they chose. But it was yet that choice that Jesus was aware of that they were going to do that enabled Jesus himself as being the image and the embodiment and the reality of the outpouring of God's love, the self-emptying love, I often describe it. Yeah. The self-emptying love of the Trinity is emptying itself, himself, herself. Our pronouns all fall short, but God is self-emptying in Christ to us. And by embracing the totality of what it means to be human and sinful, and embracing the worst that we as human beings can do to one another, that is the doorway that opens God's gift of the resurrection to and for us. Now, that is also a doorway for an immense amount of just thinking, reflecting. Does this really make sense? In a human sense, does this make sense? Is God's wisdom somewhere beyond our wisdom? What does that mean for the choices, religious choices, political choices, social choices that I make right now and the consequences of them? What does all of that mean? That's something that we need to continue to think about, pray about, reflect on, and try to integrate into our lives. This has been a Lent that nobody who observes Lent could have predicted, that none of us ever expected. It is a Lent where we are called upon not only to fast in some way from the material things and even the social things that we take for granted, but to fast from the religious things that we take for granted, including church, including the Eucharist, including, and I would say especially our relationship with one another that is comes to a focus, comes to a head in our communion with Jesus Christ. We're in communion with one another. That communion is challenged now for us to take it onto a different level, onto a new level. We are challenged to integrate more and more into our lives the meaning of the Eucharist, even as we are deprived of the physical celebration of it. It's not just, as I've said before, it's not just a spiritual communion, Lord Jesus, come into my heart. It is that, but it has to be an openness to what he does when he comes into our hearts. Because what he does is open our hearts to where he is to be found, and he is to be found in those who are suffering. He's to be found in the suffering of one another. He's to be found in the least of his brothers and sisters, as he has told us in Matthew chapter 25. So maybe because we cannot put the Eucharist given to us at the Last Supper under the form of bread and wine into action right now, we are called to put the Eucharist as found in the Gospel of John, which is at the Last Supper, the washing of the feet, into practice. So we are called in this Lent, I think, to find Jesus and his life-giving power, as we read in the raising of Lazarus. Find Jesus and his life-giving power in new ways. So anyway, I hope that those reflections may have had some value for you, for us. I'd like to again suggest that we've got 2 more weeks of Lent, that we continue reflecting on the mystery of the cross that each one of us is called now to embrace. I want to thank you all of you who have stuck with me. I'd like to thank all of you who will maybe come back to watch this again, or maybe watch it for the first time on YouTube and on Facebook. It will be available on both. You may have noticed I tried something a little bit different. I almost knocked the camera over, sorry. I tried something a little bit different this time. It's in horizontal format. It's also not in a mirror image, so I'm having a little bit difficulty telling my right hand from my left hand, but it should be a lot easier for you to tell my right hand from my left hand the way that you're looking at me. I hope that is working for you. Let me know, actually, if in the comments, would you let me know how well this is coming across? I would really appreciate it. So God bless you all, and have a blessed Sunday, and may this day which the Lord has made be a continued source of blessing for you and for all those whom you have loved. And Joe just told me that it looks great. Well, I'm grateful for that. Thank you, Joe. God bless you all. Bye-bye.